Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The battle has been long awaited. The so-called Islamic State has been in control of Mosul for over 2 years and is now defending it against an alliance of Iraqi army, Kurdish fighters, some controversial Shia militias and, of course, some US forces too. Even the RAF is involved. This is not the battle to eradicate IS completely. It is a fight to drive the group into a humiliating retreat into Syria. But there are myriad challenges ahead. It's a military challenge above all. IS is brutal. It sometimes motivates its own fighters by executing the ones who are not trying hard enough. Then there's the humanitarian challenge, 1.5 million people in the city. And then there's politics. There will at some point after the battle be a need for Sunni-Shia reconciliation. Think of how difficult it has been between the Republicans and Unionists in Northern Ireland, and then ask how hard it'll be in brutalised Mosul. Well, we'll be looking at all of these, but first here's our diplomatic editor, Mark Urban.
To the east of Mosul today, the first easy victories, clearing Kurdish villages. But signs also of the Islamic State group's capacity to resist. A car speeds into a group of Kurdish armoured vehicles before detonating a suicide bomb. IS may be losing, but it's still ready to defend its Iraqi stronghold.
Lots of the ISIS leaders and indeed many of their foreign fighters will turn towards Raqqa and Syria as their last stronghold in the Middle East. But I think it will be easier to defeat ISIS then, because we have to bear in mind ISIS is 95, if not more, percent an Iraqi organization. Their top leaders are all Iraqi. So if they're pushed out of Iraq into Syria, I think it will be easier.
The city is now surrounded, or almost so. A narrow corridor is being left open to the west to allow IS fighters and civilians to flee. Kurdish brigades are now pushing in from the east and north. Shia militias will advance from the southwest. Given the risk of sectarian conflict, these elements are meant to halt on the outskirts of Mosul. Iraqi federal troops and loyal Sunni militia will then enter the city itself from the south. That's plan A, at least.
Why leave a corridor open and drop leaflets on the city for weeks before, when that would seem to violate any idea of surprise or cutting off your enemy? Well, the answer lies in concerns about the more than 1 million people who are still trapped in Mosul, and the feeling that if there's any sort of prolonged fighting in that urban space, it could have dire humanitarian consequences.
Mosul, you are talking about 1.5 million of the population. Even though you and all what they prepared for refugees, now it's for only 60,000 persons. Can you imagine if Daesh will take the risk, and I'm sure they will do it, to push the civilian to leave the city, and then you have 1 million of refugees? It's going to be one of the worst catastrophes.
The aim is to keep the different militias apart once the city's taken, because Mosul has long been a cockpit of rivalry between Sunni and Kurd, Shia and Turk.
ISIS as a force has more or less kept all the guns pointing in the same direction. In other words, pointing towards ISIS themselves. After they are defeated militarily, it's much more likely for us to see conflict and tensions flare up. And we're not just talking about sectarian Shia-Sunni conflict, but Sunni-Sunni conflict, Shia-Shia conflict, and Kurdish-Kurdish conflict.
And if losing Mosul will be a heavy blow for IS, it still has its Syrian stronghold of Raqqa. The prospect of an assault there is still distant.
In Syria, I think it's much more complicated. You know, in Syria, it took a dimension, you know, like a Kafkaesque crisis. Absurdity has no limit. I don't know. I think it's much, when we compare relatively, it's much easier to resolve Iraq first, then Syria second.
10 years ago, the Islamic State was proclaimed in Ramadi in Iraq's Anbar province, and it was overwhelmed by a combination of force and splits within the Sunni community. The Islamic State, in the form that it's now being fought, involved many of the same people, tribes, and places. And there's the warning from history. If there isn't a convincing political solution for those Sunni communities, it's quite likely that another form of the same jihadist ideology will break out into the open again.
The Mosul offensive can deal with the immediate problem of a jihadist group holding a major Iraqi city. But what it cannot do is soothe the roiling sectarianism of that country and the sense of grievance felt by many Sunnis.
Mark Urban there. Well, Mark set out some of the difficulties, and we're going to take these step by step now. I'm joined by a large cast of guests. Retired US Army Colonel Peter Mansour, who was an executive officer to General David Petraeus in Iraq and is now Professor of Military History at Ohio State University. Rachel Harvey is an emergency responder with British charity Shelterbox, and she joins us from Erbil in Iraq. Toby Dodge, an international relations expert from the London School of Economics, is in the studio, along with Renad Mansour, a fellow of Chatham House, also an expert on the region. Well, look, good evening to you all. We're going to take this in stages, and I'd like to start, if I could, with the military before we get to humanitarian and political aspects. And Peter Mansour, you're a military expert here. How painful can IS make this military operation to get the city back?
It's going to be a slow grind. As General Steve Townsend, the commander of U.S. forces in Iraq, has said, the battle's going to take weeks, maybe months to culminate. I know Haider al-Abadi, the Prime Minister of Iraq, wants to finish it by the end of the year. The result is inevitable. The Iraqi forces with U.S. air support will end up crushing ISIS, but it will be a hard fight for that to happen. The enemy has had more than 2 years to dig into the urban landscape. He's lighting on fire pools of oil to darken the skies and make it harder for airstrikes to target him. He's rigged houses to explode and has littered the roads with roadside bombs. And so at every step of the way, the Iraqi Kurdish forces are going to meet a very stiff resistance from an enemy who's had a long, long time to prepare the battlefield. And
what's interesting is you've said, and I've heard other people saying it today, the outcome is not really in doubt here. And that's simply the numbers, is it? That the numbers on the offensive to take the city are just vastly outnumbering those in the city defending?
Well, it's numbers and it's firepower. So you have maybe upwards of 6,000, 8,000 ISIS fighters in the city, but opposing them are tens of thousands of Iraqi troops, Kurdish Peshmerga, Shiite militias if the need comes to use them. And they're backed up by U.S. Air power and coalition air power that can make any defensive position shambles with the drop of a bomb. So you'll see a lot of firepower being used and artillery and guided rockets as well.
But this
will be a one-sided fight.
Sorry to interrupt, but does that raise the possibility that in rescuing the people of Mosul, that a lot of them will be killed in the process?
I think that's inevitable, quite frankly. This is war. You can't have bloodless combat. They've left open an avenue for escape for civilians, and it's doubtful that ISIS will allow the civilians to flee. ISIS wants a humanitarian catastrophe to use it as propaganda. So this is going to be tough on the people of Mosul, but if you want to end the war against ISIS, you have to take the city.
Colonel, thank you very much. Renard, just on the timing, I mean, months, not weeks, is that what we think of this military offensive taking?
Well, I think the analysis is completely correct. We are talking months. We're not even in the city yet, it's important to note. It's going to take some time to move in, clear the villages and move in, especially because It's coalition forces. Many of them don't agree or coordinate with each other, but they all only have one enemy, and they're looking to get rid of this one enemy, that being the Islamic State, the so-called Islamic State. And two, they all need to limit civilian casualties. So as some of the generals that we're speaking to have told us, sometimes it's a matter of inches, inch by inch, and a block could take days to take over inside the city, because very much they're conscious of the fact that it's not only a military victory, but they need to make sure the civilian population, is okay with what happens.
Right. Okay, well that brings us to the issue of the humanitarian crisis. And Rachel Harvey, I wonder if I can talk to you about that. I mean, just set out, if you are, you're over there in Erbil, just set out how ready and prepared and what sort of crisis or what expectations there are over there of a humanitarian outpouring of people from Mosul.
Well, in a sense, this has been a strange response. In one sense, we've had the luxury of knowing that there will likely be a humanitarian crisis, and we don't usually get that kind of forewarning. Normally, we're reacting to an event after it's happened. So that's one positive. But beyond that, everything is unknowns. We don't know precisely how many people are even in Mosul city at the moment. It's all estimates. We don't know how many of those people will be able to flee, nor when they will flee, nor in what direction they are likely to flee. So it's a really challenging situation to know how best to respond. There have been months now of planning, which has allowed organisations here to try and pre-position aid in places as close to the areas where we think people will arrive. So Shelterbox is one of a number of organisations here that are working closely together, and it will come down to coordination and communication in the end to work out how effective this response can be. We have to be flexible. We're going to have to adapt to events as they unfold on the ground, and the humanitarian response will be dictated by what happens militarily. Right. So as the military response unfolds, we will have to react to the impact of that.
But this, as I understand it, people will probably be fleeing to the Kurdish areas nearby as the, if you like, the safe haven for them to escape to, in as far as they're going to be able to escape from the city at all.
That's our working assumption at the moment, but of course this is a region in Iraqi Kurdistan that has already taken in a number of people, both Syrian refugees and Iraqis already displaced by conflict over the past 2 years. So this area would say that it is already struggling to look after those people already here, and now it's going to be expected to take perhaps hundreds of thousands more people. And there is a scarcity of land on which to build camps. There's a shortage of resources, and with the best will in the world, with all these uncertainties of war, you can plan a military operation as tightly as you possibly can, but when it comes down to it, military operations don't always go 100% smoothly. So the humanitarian community here, Shelterbox among them, is trying to make sure that we have aid in key places to cover an area wherever people are likely to come. And they're going to need shelter, they're going to need food, they may need health, they will certainly need some kind of protection. We are trying to get all those things together in key places so that we can respond to all their needs. These are likely to be highly traumatized people, exhausted people. This is pretty inhospitable terrain, and most of these people will have walked, having experienced the kind of conflict that's just now getting underway, and before that, having lived under Islamic State for 2 years. So they are going to be in a pretty traumatized state by the time we're able to get help to them.
Rachel, thank you. Let's turn to the third section of this discussion, which is what happens when the inevitable military victory, however long it takes, succeeds. Toby, that is actually the difficult bit in some ways.
Well, I think there's been clearly a lot of planning, a lot of training for the military campaign, and my own best research would suggest there has been little or no thinking about the political aftermath. Now, if we look at the aftermath of the invasion of 2003, if we look at the aftermath of the surge in 2007, I think we see military capacity, military power being deployed to deliver political solutions. And Daesh, the Islamic State, a violent, barbaric group, is actually simply a cause of a series of political failings. And from Hyderabad down, no one has quite worked out how to reform the Iraqi system to integrate those sections of the population that are alienated and stop the Islamic State recruiting again.
Haider al-Abadi, the Prime Minister of Iraq, a man who was resident in the UK for quite a few years in Manchester University, everybody seems to say he is something of a reconciler. He's a centrist. Is he doing his best? Is he a baddie or a goodie? I mean, is he...
Let's not talk in such black and white terms, but I think Prime Minister Abadi is doing his best. He's clearly, and if you look at his opinion poll ratings, especially after replacing Nouri al-Maliki, that he was recognised or greeted with optimism. However, he's incredibly weak in a fractured and internally divided cabinet. He has little or no power. He doesn't control the Hashd-e-Shaabi, the informal Shia militias. He doesn't control the Peshmerga. The Minister of Defence has recently, over the summer, been sacked after a vote of no confidence in Parliament. This is a government that barely functions, that's run out of money, and Abadi doesn't run.
Renard, do you agree with what we've just heard about the state of the political setup in Iraq?
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think the biggest problem with Abadi is that he's facing many forces. And actually the biggest forces he's facing are within his own camp, including his predecessor, former Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki. He's still there and he's still looking for a chance to bring Abadi down. And so Abadi is also facing a big protest movement that's looking to kind of move in against him or kind of fix the state through reforms. So it's not, don't talk about sort of sectarianism. There's an internal Shia struggle that Abadi is facing.
This was the thing I heard in Mark's piece, which I was not aware that we all know Sunni Shia. It's the multiple dimensions of sectarian and potential conflict that is a problem, really.
The point is the post-2003 system is so illegitimate, is so broken that it's not only Sunnis, for want of a better term, it's Shias. You have a mass protest movement from the summer of 2015 onwards, decrying the almost universal corruption amongst the governing elite, asking in a once oil-rich country why they can't get electricity at the height of the summer. We have a completely dysfunctional system and no one has yet come up with a plan to fix it.
Right. What will be your plan to fix it? I mean, what is the political settlement that you're waiting for that will be different to the period after the surge or after the original invasion, when it did basically retreat into the most awful situation very quickly?
Yeah, well, I think the period after the surge might offer a good example of at least trying to bring these disenfranchised Sunni populations back to the table, back to the bargaining table. But obviously we need to sustain that. And the problem, again, is we have a military victory that we're looking for, but no one's really talking about that political victory. We have plans, many different plans, but no plan.
Right. But when you bring them back to the table, what is it that you're going to get them to try and agree on? I mean, is it a sort of an autonomous region for the Sunnis so that they're like the Kurds and it's a kind of a much more federal system? What's the game plan there?
Yeah, again, it's very, very complicated as well because they also have different ideas of what they want. The Sunni population isn't one force, just like the Shias aren't. So this is complicated. But what we need to do is give them autonomy, try and build sort of systems of governance, local governance in the different provinces so that they can start to sort their own affairs. What's happening today is a reaction of what former Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki did when he started to centralize his power. The first step has to be to bring them back and get them on a discussion because communication is key to this.
I think we've learned a lot tonight, probably enough for one evening. Thank you all very much indeed, Rachel. All of you, thank you very much.